Making it absolutely clear to organisations, look, please don't come around asking me to do things and expecting me to say yes.
One of the most famous inheritance in the British royal family had been held firmly by King Charles for years, and no one dared to question it. Not until Prince Edward's lawyers presented documents that changed the entire story. If Charles claimed it for years, how did Edward become the true heir? And what was written in those papers? An inheritance of significance. There is a rule in the British royal family that most people on the outside never think about. It is a rule that has nothing to do with popularity or power. It has nothing to do with who is liked more or who works most. It is a rule written into the law of the land, and it operates automatically without anyone needing to push a button or sign a paper. The rule is simple. When a man becomes King of England, every title he was holding as a prince disappears. It merges back into the crown. And that one quiet legal fact set the stage for one of the most quiet, dramatic stories inside Buckingham Palace in a very long time. The Duke of Edinburgh title is one of the oldest and most respected titles in the whole of Britain. It was first created in 1726 by King George I for his grandson, Prince Frederick. Since that moment, the title has been held by only a small number of people across nearly 300 years of royal history. Each person who carried it gave it a different kind of weight. But of all the people who ever held it, none built a more lasting connection to it than Prince Philip, who received the title in 1947 and carried it until his passing in 2021. Philip did not simply wear the title, he made it mean something far beyond its name. When King George VI gave the Dukedom of Edinburgh to Philip Mountbatten just before his marriage to Princess Elizabeth, it was an act of trust and welcome. Philip had been born into the Greek and Danish royal families, but he had chosen Britain. He had given up his foreign titles, taken British citizenship, and committed his life to the woman who would one day become queen. The title of Duke of Edinburgh was the crown's formal statement that Philip belonged here, that his role in the life of the nation was real and permanent. Philip understood exactly what had been given to him, and he spent the next 7 decades proving he deserved it. Philip passed away on April 9, 2021 at Windsor Castle. He was 99 years old. He had spent decades standing one step behind the Queen, supporting her, traveling with her, and representing Britain in every corner of the world. He reduced his public duties in 2017, but had never truly stopped caring about the work that bore his name. When he passed away, the whole country paused to honor a man who had given his life entirely to service. And in the legal background of that moment, something happened that most people did not notice at all. The title of Duke of Edinburgh passed automatically to Charles. This was not a decision anyone had made. There was no meeting, there was no ceremony. Royal law simply states that when a duke passes on, his eldest son inherits his title. Charles was Philip's eldest son, so from the moment Philip took his last breath, Charles became the Duke of Edinburgh. He was still the Prince of Wales at that point. He was still the heir to the throne. He was holding both titles at once, and he knew perfectly well that he could not keep the Edinburgh title for long, because the moment he became king, it would be gone. The reason for this goes back to the fundamental structure of British monarchy. A king cannot hold a dukedom, as it is a rank below the throne. When Charles became King Charles III in September 2022, the day his mother passed away at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, every title he had been holding as a prince merged into the crown. The Duchy of Cornwall passed immediately to William, who was now the heir. The Duke of Edinburgh simply vanished back into the ownership of the crown, with no holder, no home, and no destination. The title that Philip had spent 73 years building was suddenly nowhere at all. Everyone inside the palace had known this moment was coming. It was not a surprise. Royal historians had explained it for years, and the royal family's own legal advisors had been clear about what would happen. The moment Charles sat on the throne, the Edinburgh title would go back to the crown, and it would then be Charles's decision entirely what to do with it.
He'll pick and choose what he wants to do and how he wants to do it, and what's sensible and what's practical. So, as I said, I don't think we'll see it completely.
He could give it to someone right away. He could wait years before deciding. He could, in theory, choose never to recreate it at all. There was nothing in law that forced him to act on any particular timeline. And this is exactly where the underlying tension began to build. There had been a very public promise made years before any of this happened. A promise made in front of the whole country. a promise that had named Prince Edward, the youngest of the Queen's sons, as the person who would one day receive the title. A promise that had been agreed to not just by the Queen and Philip, but by Charles himself. And now that the title had passed through Charles's hands and dissolved back into the crown, the only person who could bring it back to life was the same man who had already agreed it should belong to his younger brother. The question was whether he would honor what he had agreed to and how long it would take him to do it. A promise made to honor. The story of the promise starts in June 1999 at Windsor Castle, and it begins with a wedding. Edward, the youngest child of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, was marrying Sophie Rhys-Jones. He was 35 years old. Sophie was 34. They had been together for several years and had chosen to keep their relationship private for as long as possible, knowing that the moment it became public, the press attention would be relentless. Their decision to marry at Windsor instead of Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's Cathedral told the world something important about who they were. They were not interested in spectacle, they just wanted something real. The ceremony at St. George's Chapel was smaller than a traditional royal wedding. The guest list was more intimate, and the tone was warmer. Edward and Sophie stood at the altar looking like two people who genuinely wanted to be there, rather than two figures performing a role for public entertainment. The guests watching them could feel the difference. And when the day was done and the couple had begun their married life together, the palace made an announcement that would have consequences no one in that room could yet fully understand. Edward would be given the title of Earl of Wessex, not a duke, an earl. This was a deliberate and unusual choice. Sons of the monarch are normally given dukedoms when they marry. Charles had been born the Duke of Cornwall. Andrew had become the Duke of York on his wedding day. The tradition was clear and well established, but Edward was being made an earl instead, and the palace explained why. The plan, agreed upon by the Queen, Philip, and Charles, was that Edward would eventually receive a much greater title, the Dukedom of Edinburgh. He would hold the earldom for the time being, and that when Philip passed away and the Edinburgh title became available, it would pass to Edward. That announcement did something important. It made the promise public. It was not a private agreement kept between family members in a drawing room. It was told to the country. It was made open to the world. The palace press office made the statement clear and simple. The earldom was a placeholder, while the dukedom was the destination. The Queen had agreed, Prince Philip had agreed, Charles had agreed. All three of the most important people in the royal family at that moment had formally confirmed that Edward was the future Duke of Edinburgh. And once that was said out loud in front of the whole world, it became something that would be very difficult to walk back. For Philip, this agreement was not just an administrative arrangement about titles. It was personal in a way that went deeper than royal protocol. The Dukedom of Edinburgh was his life's work in name, as much as in practice. He had built the Duke of Edinburgh as a ward from a small program launched in 1956 into one of the most recognized youth development programs anywhere in the world. By 1999, the award was already operating in dozens of countries. Hundreds of thousands of young people were completing it every year. Philip had spent his own money and his own time to make it grow. The title was inseparable from the work, and Edward had already been part of that work for years. He had earned his Gold Award in 1986, while studying at Cambridge University. He had become a trustee of the United Kingdom Award in 1988, only 2 years after completing it himself. By the time the title promise was made public, Edward had already been involved with the award for over a decade. He was not someone who had shown interest in the title and then hoped the work would follow. He had come to the work first and found that it matched everything he valued. Philip saw this clearly, and it mattered to him enormously when the agreement was shaped. Philip had 4 children, and he loved all of them. But he was also a man who had spent his life in service, and he respected service above almost anything else. He had watched Charles navigate the heavy burden of being heir to the throne. He had watched Anne build one of the most impressive records of royal duty of any working royal in the family. He had watched Andrew serve as a naval officer and then struggle with the weight of public life in ways that ended badly. And he had watched Edward quietly, consistently, without drama, without headlines, without complaint, doing the work that mattered. The promise made in 1999 reflected what Philip saw in his youngest son. The years that followed the wedding tested that promise in ways no one could have predicted. The world changed, and the royal family did too. Prince Philip aged and gradually stepped back. The Queen remained at the center of everything, but could not be there forever. Edward and Sophie settled into Bagshot Park in Surrey and raised their 2 children, Louise and James, as privately as any royal family possibly could. In 2002, Edward gave up his television production company and committed himself entirely to royal duties. He added patronages, attended engagements, and took on more of his father's schedule as Prince Philip reduced his own. By the time Prince Philip officially retired from public duties in 2017, Edward had already been quietly stepping into his father's shoes for years. When his father passed away in April 2021, and then when the Queen followed in September 2022, the 2 conditions attached to the original promise had both been met. The title was now available. The decision belonged to Charles, and Edward, who had been waiting with patience for 23 years, was standing there with a life's worth of work to show for it. Making it official, on one condition. In the weeks and months after King Charles III took the throne, the machinery of the monarchy was moving at extraordinary speed. A new king meant new arrangements across the entire structure of the royal family. Titles shifted, roles changed. The working family reorganized itself around the new reality. William became the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Cornwall. Catherine became the Princess of Wales. The whole institution adjusted to reflect the fact that a new era had begun. And at the center of one very specific and quietly complicated conversation was the question of what would happen to the Dukedom of Edinburgh. The title had vanished the moment Charles became king. Everyone who understood royal law had known it would happen. But having a clear plan for what came was a different thing. In the public record, there had been a report published in July 2021, while the Queen was still alive, which claimed that Charles had already decided he would not give the title to Edward. The report came from a credible source. Clarence House, which was Charles's official residence and press operation at the time, did not deny it outright. They only said that no final decisions had been made. That qualified non-denial was enough to send a wave of anxiety through royal fans following the story for years now. Then the Queen passed away, and Charles became king, and months passed with no announcement. Edward continued his duties as the Earl of Wessex. He attended events, he traveled, he kept working for the award scheme. He gave no public indication of frustration or impatience. But behind the surface, there was a very real legal and administrative process underway. And it was more complicated than simply deciding to hand a title from one brother to another. The question of how to structure the title legally was one that required careful thought, precise legal drafting, and a clear understanding of what the title should mean for the future of the monarchy as a whole. The central issue was inheritance. Most dukedoms are hereditary, meaning that when the holder is no more, the title passes to his son, or closest male heir. If Charles recreated the Dukedom of Edinburgh as a standard hereditary title and gave it to Edward, then when Edward passed away, it would pass to Edward's son, James. James would become the next Duke of Edinburgh, and that would effectively lock the title into Edward's line permanently, taking it out of reach for any future arrangement Charles or William might want to make. In particular, it would make the title unavailable for Princess Charlotte, William's daughter, who was widely discussed as a possible future holder. The conversation about Charlotte was not accidental. Charlotte is second in line to the throne, one of the most prominent members of the younger generation of the royal family. The Dukedom of Edinburgh has historically been associated with figures who stand very close to the crown itself. Philip received it on the eve of his wife's ascension to the throne. It carries a weight and a prestige that makes it appropriate for someone of Charlotte's future standing. William, who would one day become king, might very well want to give the title to his daughter, but that could only happen if the title came back to the crown when Edward passed rather than going to James. So, the legal team worked on a solution that would honor the promise to Edward while protecting the crown's future flexibility. The answer was a life peerage. The Dukedom of Edinburgh would be recreated and given to Edward, but the letters patent creating it would specify that the title was for his lifetime only. When Edward passes away, the title would revert to the crown. James would not inherit it. The Earldom of Wessex, which Edward had held since 1999, would pass to James instead, giving the young man a title of his own, while keeping the more prestigious Edinburgh title within the king's gift for the future. The letters patent were drafted with care. Every word in a document of that kind carries legal weight that will be studied for generations. The people doing the legal work understood this, so there was no rush. They were building something that had to be exactly right. And when the work was done, and Charles had reviewed and approved every element of it, the announcement was ready to be made. The date chosen was March 10, 2023, Edward's 59th birthday, a deliberate choice that added personal warmth to what was also a significant legal moment. On that morning, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles was pleased to confer the Dukedom of Edinburgh upon his brother, Prince Edward.
The UK has a new Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. King Charles has given the prestigious title to his brother, Prince Edward, and wife, Sophie.
From that day forward, Edward was the Duke of Edinburgh. Sophie became the Duchess of Edinburgh. The family titles reshuffled exactly as planned, with James receiving the earldom and the family stepping into its new configuration. The lawyers had done their work. The letters patent were sealed. The promise that was made before an entire nation was now written into the legal record of the British Crown. And the title that had belonged to Philip for 73 years had found its next home. The royal family's reaction. When the announcement landed on the morning of March 10, 2023, the reaction from the public was warm and largely positive. Most people who heard the news felt it was long overdue. Edward had been waiting for more than 2 decades. He had done the work, he had earned the respect, and now the title was his. But inside the walls of the palace and among the inner circle of the royal family, the moment carried a very different kind of meaning. It was not simply a man receiving a title. It was the culmination of a story that had been running for years, and a real tension between what was promised and what had actually been delivered. To understand the shock that rippled through parts of the royal family, it helps to step back and look at where the institution stood in early 2023. For years, the working royal family had been shrinking. Prince Andrew had been effectively removed from public royal life following the chaotic fallout from his association with Jeffrey Epstein and the disastrous television interview he gave in November 2019. That interview, in which he attempted to explain his friendship with Epstein and showed what many viewers felt was a striking lack of empathy for the victims, destroyed whatever remained of his public standing. Shamefully, his military titles and royal patronages were stripped. He stepped back permanently from official duties. The Duke of York title remained his legally, but it was now an empty name, attached to a man who could no longer represent the crown anywhere. Meanwhile, Prince Harry and Meghan had made their own separate and dramatic departure. They had announced in January 2020 that they were stepping back from senior royal duties, a decision that blindsided much of the royal family and generated weeks of difficult headlines. The couple had then moved to California, given interviews that described painful and damaging tensions inside the family, and Harry had published a memoir in January 2023 that contained revelations about his relationship with Charles and William that shocked even people who thought they already knew the full story. Harry was no longer a working royal in any meaningful sense. He was living his own life on the other side of the world, and his relationship with the family he had left behind was fractured in ways that showed no sign of healing quickly. These 2 losses, Andrew's disgrace and Harry's exit, had left enormous gaps in the working structure of the monarchy. The institution needed people it could trust and deploy. It needed people who would show up without creating controversy, who would travel without generating headlines for the wrong reasons, and who would represent the crown with dignity and consistency. And in that environment, Edward and Sophie had become very indispensable. They had always been reliable, but now they were essential. The palace leaned on them constantly, and they responded every single time. When the dukedom was confirmed, the shift inside the family was not just symbolic. It changed how Edward was positioned and how the palace used him. As Earl of Wessex, he had been a working royal, respected and trusted, but not a figure who commanded the kind of international recognition that opens doors at the highest levels of diplomacy. As Duke of Edinburgh, everything changed. The name he carried now became relevant to heads of government, to Commonwealth leaders, to presidents and prime ministers who might not have known the Earl of Wessex but absolutely knew the significance of the Edinburgh title and the award scheme it represented. Edward was now walking into rooms with a different kind of authority behind him. And inside the family, the people who had been closest to Edward during the long years of waiting felt something between relief and vindication when the confirmation came. They had watched the reports suggesting the title might not come. They had felt the weight of the silence that followed Charles becoming king. They had understood even if they never said it publicly, that the months without an announcement had been uncomfortable and that the uncertainty had been obvious. When it was finally settled, the relief was genuine and deep. For Charles, the decision to give the title to Edward was also a statement about the kind of king he wanted to be. He had inherited a throne at a moment of enormous pressure and public scrutiny. He was navigating the legacy of his mother's extraordinary reign, managing a family that had been publicly fractured, and trying to modernize the monarchy while still honoring its traditions. Giving Edward the Edinburgh title was an act that honored a promise, respected his father's wish, and acknowledged the loyalty of the brother who had never caused him a moment of trouble. It was one of the most important decisions Charles made in the early months of his reign. The title's place in the monarchy. By the beginning of 2024, the British royal family was facing a level of internal pressure that had rarely been seen in modern times. King Charles had been admitted to hospital in late January for treatment relating to an enlarged prostate. The procedure was said to have been successful. But in the days that followed, while Charles was recovering and his medical team was reviewing the results of the procedure, they found something else, something that needed serious attention. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that the king had been diagnosed with cancer. The specific type was not disclosed out of respect for the king's privacy. The palace announced that Charles would be stepping back from public-facing duties while he began treatment. The whole country was shocked. Charles had only been king for a little over a year. He had been working at a remarkable pace since taking the throne, traveling, holding audiences, delivering speeches, and trying to establish himself in a role he had been preparing for his entire life. And now, he was ill in a way that required him to reduce his public schedule significantly. For the working royal family, this was an immediate and practical crisis. The king could not cover his own engagements. Someone had to step into the space he was leaving. At almost the same moment, the Princess of Wales was also dealing with a serious health challenge. Catherine had undergone abdominal surgery in January 2024 and had been expected to return to public duties by Easter. But in March 2024, she appeared in a personal video and revealed that she too had been diagnosed with cancer and was undergoing preventive chemotherapy. The news was devastating for the public and for the royal family. Two of the most prominent and hard-working members of the working monarchy were dealing with serious illness. The institution was under pressure that had no modern precedent. Into this gap, Edward and Sophie stepped with a determination that left even longtime royal observers genuinely impressed. They were already hard-working and trusted, but at that point, they found a completely different gear. Edward attended hundreds of engagements across the United Kingdom and overseas. He represented the king at events. He took on diplomatic visits that required the kind of senior representation that only the most trusted members of the family could provide. By the end of 2024, the tally showed that Edward ranked fourth among all working royals for the number of engagements carried out. Sophie ranked fifth. Edward's international work in 2024 alone covered massive ground. He traveled to South Africa and St. Helena in January, connecting with Commonwealth communities and representing the crown at formal occasions. In March, he was in Uganda for the Duke of Edinburgh's International Award, meeting with the country's president and visiting schools where young people were working toward their awards. He and Sophie made an official visit to Malta in the autumn. Each visit reinforced the same message. The Duke of Edinburgh was not a ceremonial title sitting on a shelf. It was an active office being used every single day. The award scheme continued to grow under Edward's stewardship. The Duke of Edinburgh's International Award now operates in 129 countries, with millions of young people participating at any given time. When Edward arrives in a country to represent the scheme, he arrives carrying a name that those young people and their families recognize. He arrives as the person who is continuing the work of a man who built something truly global. Prince Philip spent the last decades of his life watching the award expand beyond anything he had initially imagined. Edward is now the person responsible for making sure it continues to expand. Into 2025, the pace continued without any sign of slowing down. Edward represented King Charles on a visit to India in February, meeting with government officials and youth leaders to promote the award program. He traveled to Canada to visit naval installations and community organizations. He went to Papua New Guinea for the country's 50th independence anniversary, a genuinely significant Commonwealth diplomatic moment. He and Sophie visited Japan together on an official engagement that touched on cultural exchange and bilateral friendship. And in the autumn, they traveled to Monaco for a meeting with Prince Albert II and Princess Charlene. The question of what becomes of the title after Edward is already part of the long-term royal planning conversation. The dukedom was given as a life peerage. When Edward passes on, it returns to the crown. The title has always sat close to the heart of the succession, and if William becomes king and chooses to give it to his daughter Charlotte, it would continue that tradition in the most natural way possible. For now, the title lives with Edward, and Edward is giving it everything he has. After more than 2 decades of waiting, he is making absolutely certain that the name means as much under his stewardship as it ever did under his father's.